Good afternoon. How wonderful. How wonderful to see you. And that's a yes up, volume okay. Good. How wonderful, and thank you. Those that come from afar and those that come from around the corner, it's an honor and a privilege. Thank you so much for coming out. Stories find their tellers. Would you agree, storytellers? Stories find their tellers. They really do. And some of you traveled on the same ship with me and Noel. We had the pleasure, Noel and I were traveling up to Alaska in the spring. And we stopped at Juneau. And as happenstance, coincidence, synchronicity, a woman came up to us and said, "You have to go to the State Museum." And we said, "Why?" And she said, "You have to go to the State Museum." And we went to the State Museum. Noel is a meticulous man who looked at each exhibit. I was enthralled with the space. There were boats up on the roof. It was exquisite. But there was one exhibit that was partial. There were items missing in the exhibit. And I thought, what's that about? And I was intrigued. There was a dish with the name Princess Sophia. And I went to the lady, the curator, and said, "What is this?" And she said, "Ah." So my curiosity was piqued. I had to find out, and I spent the next few weeks and months digging. And like a ripple effect, it grew. And out of it came this story. My name is the Princess Sophia. Oh, some pronounce it Sophia, but I prefer Sophia. I am very proud of my royal lineage. I'll have you know I was named after Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Princess Sophie. I'm one of a fleet of 32 ships that served the Pacific West Coast out here in the early 20th century. But the story I want to share with you pertains to a particular moment in that time, in the events of October 1918. Now, my own story begins just a few years earlier, in 1910. I was designed and built in Scotland. Scottish stuff. I was designed by Bowen McLaughlin, Scottish boat builders. I was designed with these waters in mind. Solid, reliable, sturdy were words used to describe me. But I'll have you know, I was also very comfortable. I had a large forward lounge, an observation lounge with these great windows to admire the coastal scenery. And there was also a salon on board with this magnificent piano that belonged to Ada Murray. Oh, the events that happened in that salon. Yes. There was also a 112-seat dining hall. It had maple paneling and mahogany trim. Oh, quite attractive, really. But I was a practical ship. And I also had full telecommunication, wireless, as well as electricity and heating. And I was popular. I was one of the most popular on that run, actually. And so my mission right from the beginning was the same, was to link the South with the North. Now, by the South, I mean Vancouver and Victoria. Victoria was my home port. And by the north, I mean Alaska. By solid, I want to tell you that I was originally a coal steamer, but converted to oil. My 2 tanks of oil were about close to 3,000 barrels. I could use up 240 barrels a day. And so I was the toast of the West. I also was a troop carrier in the early part of the war. I ushered troops, the boys, from Vancouver Island over to the mainland and then beyond. I also ferried all manner of goods and people up and down the coast. So, there you have it. Background. Details. Oh, interesting, I'm sure. But not the reason that I want to share this story with you. The real reason that we're here. I want to tell you about the events of October 1918. It started on the 19th. That was a Saturday evening, about 9 p.m. I was just pulling out of Pier D at Cole Harbour in Vancouver. As is usual in Vancouver in October, it was raining. And I headed up to my northerly destination, which of course was Skagway. Now, as some of you mariners may know, and some of you are seasoned mariners, I took the inside passage. That was the preferred route, all the way up to Skagway. Why the inside passage? Because it was safest. It allowed me to stop at certain towns and villages. It had also allowed me to avoid some of those coastal storms. The trip up was quite uneventful. We went through our usual stops, that is, Prince Rupert, up to Ketchikan, Sitka, Juneau, and finally our final destination all the way up to Skagway. Well, Skagway, by the time we arrived, was the 22nd, so that was the Tuesday. Skagway was abuzz with activity. It was the day of the great sourdough dance. So people had gathered from all over the north. And they were having a grand old time with dancing and singing. The pier was full of people. We were not scheduled to leave until 7 p.m. the following day, on the Wednesday. The pier was crowded with people and animals and all kinds of cargo. It was announced that the Yukon train was delayed. That meant we would be delayed, for many of the passengers on the train were coming on board my ship. And so we waited. We waited in the chaos. Most of the passengers that did arrive boarded. Now, who were these passengers, you may well ask? Well, there were 2 groups that I know of. There was the one group where they're the workers, the seasonal workers that left at the end of the season to go back to their homes in Vancouver, Victoria, and beyond. And then there were those who had decided that the north was enough. They needed to relocate to the south. About 280 people were on the books that night as passengers. But I can tell you we were just over 300 with the stowaways. In those passengers, there were a variety of people. One of them was Charles Kagawa. Charles was originally from Japan, and he had dreams of making it big in the mines. So Charles had come here to Vancouver Island and worked in the coal mines, but realized that wasn't working out. So So he got bitten by the gold dust, and up he went to Dawson. But the mines didn't work for Charles either, and he ended up as a cook. Then he heard about Siberian gold, and Charles said, he sold up everything but a one-way ticket to Vancouver, and was on his way to Siberia. Another passenger was Walter Barnes. Now, Walter was a character. Walter was the consummate miner, determined to make it big. And he did. He was part of the El Dorado claim. He had struck it rich. And it was time, after 18 years in the mines, to go back and find a quieter life. There were many families on board, but the largest family unit was the O'Briens. Now, Bill O'Brien, originally from Toronto, also was bitten by the adventure bug, and he came all the way out here with his family and became interested in not only business, but politics. Bill O'Brien had a wonderful singing voice, and he loved to perform at fundraisers, was very involved in the community. His wife, Sarah, known as Sadie, was also involved in community and was a member of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, the IODE. Sadie and her 5 children were all on board, ages 2 to 14. I well remember little Pearl, dancing and skipping her way so excitedly all along the decks. But the most colorful of all the characters was definitely Lulu May Eads. Lulu May. Lulu May was Dawson's dance hall queen. Lulu May knew what she wanted. She came up to sing and dance and make her fortune. She married the boss, Murray Eads, and they decided it was time to relocate. But Lulu May had a premonition. She wouldn't step on board any ship for 20 years. No, she said, I have a feeling that we're not going to make it. What, said Murray? I have a feeling we're going to end up in that water. Lulu May. She had all manner of jewels, loved her bling, and she carried it in a sack with her at all times. She came on board with the great sack around her neck. Her jewels were not going to be far from her. As far as the crew, at the command of the ship was Captain Leonard Locke. Captain Locke was a seasoned mariner, 66 years old. He knew his way on the water. He grew up in Halifax and went to sea with his father at 16, eventually wanted to see the other coast, join Canadian Pacific, and for the last 25 years had been working the northerly routes up and down. He knew those waters. His first, second, and third mates were all young men from Vancouver Island. Jeremiah Shaw, Jerry Shaw, and the Goss brothers. That was Frank and Walter. Frank was the second mate, where his brother was Walter. The two of them, charming young men from Victoria, thought it would be a great idea to just have a final party, be part of that sourdough dance. I mean, we're off on a trip full of people and work. Well, Frank was a little more conscientious than his younger brother, Walter. Frank got there on time for the sailing, but Walter just wanted one more spin on the dance floor. And he had to sprint to get down to that pier at Skagway, only to arrive in time to see our stern lights pulling away. Walter was crushed. There were young boys on board too, 16-year-olds. Because you see, at the time, there was a great flu epidemic that went right through the state, all the way through here in the province of BC. Spanish flu was rampant. Lionel Olson and Fred Barnes, they were two Vancouver high school students that said, the schools are closed, let's grab a job. And they got on in Vancouver and stayed with us in Skagway. Fred Harvey was a veteran, and he had come back from the war and had just spent months recuperating and said he was ready to go back to work. Came on as a waiter. There were 67 crew members. 12 of them were Chinese men led by Jimmy Yu. He was the head cook. The rest were all his pantry men and porters. And finally, there was Helen Banning, the only woman member of the crew. She was the stewardess. Now, Helen, I want to tell you about. She was 35 from England and loved her job. Helen was also a wonderful knitter, and she knit all kinds of socks for the boys overseas. She'd raffle them off on the trips, and then people wouldn't even take the socks. They'd give them back to her, so she'd keep raffling them and made $1,500. A wonderful assortment of crew. The cargo, 2 tons of household goods were on board that day. 2 tons because, of course, some of those families were relocating. Dozens and dozens of packages. Dozens of packages going overseas for the boys overseas. And 24 horses. 24. One in particular I want you to know about. Billy. Billy was a great white horse, 18 years old. Had been Walter Barnes' horse. And Walter said, I'm not leaving Billy. Billy is coming to celebrate retirement with me south of Vancouver. And Billy was on board. The other 23 horses belonged to Herb MacDonald. Herb was from Winnipeg and had moved to Dawson, and he too was involved in the mines, and these animals were his draft animals. So there is a smattering of who and what was aboard. I keep avoiding the story, don't I? We did sail away from Skagway. 3 hours and 10 minutes behind schedule. That did not appeal to Captain Locke. Captain Locke was a fastidious man, serious man who valued punctuality more than anything else. We set out and the weather was fairly calm. There was a light drizzle, but the winds were calm. That all changed an hour outside of Skagway. When we rounded Battery Point, the winds had picked up. We were heading into a full winter storm. By about 2 a.m., we had come into the Lynn Canal. Now, the Lynn Canal is that longest and deepest fjord, about 90 miles long. So Skagway is at the top of the Lynn Canal, and Juneau at the bottom, about a little over a 90-mile distance. There are many challenges in the Lynn Canal. The locals call it the greatest wind tunnel made. But one of the main challenges was an outcropping of rock halfway down the canal. This rugged outcropping was really the top of an underwater mountain. It was over half an acre wide. This was called Vanderbilt Reef. Now, Vanderbilt Reef was a major hazard in the canal. There were no markers, no indications of the reef. There was a small unlit marker at the south end of the reef. It was black and green in color. Black and green in color. Unlit. Well, that was fine on a calm summer day. But on a wild winter day with the winds blowing, at night, at 2 a.m., completely useless. Oh, mariners had complained about it for years, but as often happened with Alaskan complaints, they fell on deaf ears. But so we continued down the Lynn Canal. It was now 2 a.m. We were going at full speed, 12 knots. We were, after all, 3 hours behind schedule. And we were also a full nautical mile off course. Normally, the captain, when he's trying to find position in poor visibility, he will use two methods, and certainly Captain Locke was aware of these. One of them was compass, obviously. The other was whistle. He would blow my whistle, and he would wait for the echo to return to him to know the approximate distance that he was from the shore. Reliable in fair weather, absolutely not in poor, especially in snow. Captain Locke used both methods that night. To 10 a.m. precisely, the inevitable happened. The inevitable happened. I slammed into Vanderbilt Reef. I didn't stop on impact. My bow lifted up and I slid and I scraped my way across that reef, groaning and grinding my way against those rocks, and then came to a full stop. Well, you can imagine going from full speed to a full stop in a few yards. The entire ship was in chaos. People, men, women, children were tossed about like bowling pins. The captain immediately took command, and he wanted to check on the crew and to bring out all the lifeboats on their davits. They were brought out immediately. But then, on further assessment, there I was, fully entrenched, caught on that reef. I wasn't moving. And he looked outside at this full winter storm and thought, I cannot possibly put one passenger out in that night, not one. So Captain Locke recalled the order and had the lifeboats brought back in. He then asked the crew to go check on all the passengers to see if anyone had been injured, and first and foremost, to what extent had we been damaged. Fortunately, by some amazing miracle, my hull had been damaged, but I was double-hulled steel. Thank goodness. So the damage meant that no water was coming on board. The passengers were very fortunate. Although they'd been tossed about, many of them shocked out of their sleep. Some of them were still in the salon having their midnight drinks, but most of them were fine. So Captain Locke immediately went to the wireless communicator, that's Doug Robinson, and told him to notify Juneau of the incident. That was protocol. The rest of us, all passengers, stunned on board. The crew, shaken, and those animals in the hold, terrified. Frank Lowell was the CPR agent on duty in Juneau. He received the call at 3:15 a.m. and he went into action. He knew what he had to do, so he immediately put an all points out to any vessels in the area to go directly to Vanderbilt Reef to assist in the recovery and the rescue of these stranded passengers. Well, no one complied. There was no one that was ready to go out in that storm. They full well knew what was happening in the Lynn Canal. So Frank went himself in the early morning hours down to the pier in Juneau and ordered the boats to go. The Sophia is stranded on the reef. And some said, absolutely, we'll go. The Amy and the Estebeth were the first two. Some small fishing vessels followed right after. Eventually, that morning, a little flotilla of boats made their way up into the canal, surrounding us. Well, that gave all passengers, crew, and even the captain some comfort. But the storm had increased. The storm had increased to such an extent that the wind was blowing and the waves were so high that Captain Locke warned them off. He said, no, this is on the bridge with a megaphone. None of these ships had communication, as we did. He is calling them off because he knows that they're jeopardizing their own safety. And they agreed. No passenger would have been sent or rescued from one boat to the next. So the rescue ships went and found safety at Sentinel Harbor, 3 miles south. They tried again, the Amy and the Estebeth, to come back at 1 o'clock. The wind had picked up. It was even worse out in the canal with the great winds. And the captain shook his head and warned them off a second time. When they had departed, passengers were now getting a little more fearful. And I heard the captain. I heard him talking to the first and second mate. He mentioned the Clallam. The Clallam was a ship that had run aground a few years earlier in the Juan de Fuca Straits. The Clallam had started to take on water, and the captain had ordered the evacuation of the women and the children. All the lifeboats were pulled out. 54 women with infants and children were put in the boats. When they reached the water, within minutes they were swamped. All lifeboats overturned, and 54 lives were lost. Oh, Captain Locke remembered the Clallam. And he looked at Jerry Shaw, his first mate, and said, there'll be no Clallam on my watch. The Amy and the Estebeth didn't know what to do, and rest of the vessels, there were all manner of little fishing vessels ready to help, but they could not get near the reef, not near us in any way. All day, Captain Locke tried to reach the Cedar. The Cedar was the largest ship that he knew was in the area, but he could not reach the Cedar. Captain John Ledbetter was in command of the Cedar, and he had no idea what had happened to us on that reef. Finally, when he did hear, it was late afternoon. It took him till 8 p.m. to arrive at Vanderbilt Reef. And when he arrived, he was in full winter storm. Now his boat, the Cedar, would have accommodated all our passengers and all our crew quite comfortably. But he too met the same problem as the Amy and the Estebeth. The seas were churning, the wind had picked up, and both captains over the wireless agreed that there would be no offloading of passengers this night. They had a plan, 5 a.m. Come back at 5 a.m. when it is king tide, the high tide, and we will be buoyant and able to offload passengers more safely. Captain Ledbetter agreed. He withdrew to Sentinel Island, but worried about all of us. As for us on board, it was a difficult night. At 4:30 earlier, we had lost power. We now had no electricity and no heat in a dark ship. It was a very difficult night. Some of the plans of rescue. This went on all day. He tried again at 1 in the afternoon. This time the smaller ships attempted to come with him, to no avail. They could not get near the ship safely. They would jeopardize their own crew and vessel. So they all withdrew the ships to Sentinel Island, waiting for any kind of sign. As Captain Ledbetter was at Sentinel Island in the lee of the island, so in quite safe area, he received a message from our ship. Doug Robinson was still at his post when he said, "Come quickly, ship foundering on rocks." Well, Captain Ledbetter looked at his crew and said, "We've got to go back." And they said, "How?" "We've got to go back." By the time they prepared to go, a second message came in from our ship, Doug, who stayed at his post, and said, "For God's sake, come quickly. The water is in my room." Captain Ledbetter summoned the crew immediately and said, "We are going to make every attempt we can to go into the Lynn Canal. Let's go." And they tried valiantly, but were so buffeted by winds, he was jeopardizing the lives of every person on board. He had to turn back. And so all that night, he kept watch, praying that he had heard incorrectly, praying that Doug Robinson's message was, "Ship pounding on the rocks." "Please God," he said, "it's pounding." Early the next morning, Captain Ledbetter, who hadn't slept at all, led the flotilla of rescue ships as they returned to the Lynn Canal. When he turned the point at Sentinel Island and came out into full canal, the weather had changed. The wind was down. The snow was lighter. The seas were still in swell, but nowhere near what they had been. But Captain Ledbetter looked out on the bridge and couldn't believe his eyes. He looked again and had his first mate look. At first his heart leapt. Maybe the ship has gone to Juneau. And then he saw it. He saw it. 20 feet of my mast sticking up out of the water. "No," he said, "it's impossible." And he had all the rescue vessels circle around the reef. All of them. They couldn't believe their eyes where a ship fully loaded with passengers and cargo had been sitting less than a day. There was a bare reef. It was inconceivable. He circled the reef. He circled the reef. They stayed in the area until finally, with heavy heart, he had to summon Juneau with these 6 words: "No sign of life. No hope." With no passengers, with nothing visible, and with no witnesses and no survivors, the story of what really happened on that reef went into the realm of conjecture for years. But I am here to tell you what happened. I know very well what happened. It was 4 o'clock when the wind had changed. The wind picked up to such an extent that the captain thought that we would become buoyant on the reef, and that might give us a chance to be released. But no, the winds and the surf together had pushed us off the reef in such a way that it ripped right through my double hull, like a can of sardines and made such a huge hole in my bow that the seawater came rushing in like a dam burst. My bow was firmly stuck on the reef where the rest of us were floating in that open, frigid water with water coming on board. There was no time for an evacuation. There was no time. We couldn't organize any evacuation. It happened so quickly. The water rushed in to such an extent that the boiler exploded. And that in turn caused the 2 tanks in the engine room full of crude oil to rupture. So now we had the water and the oil, and the passengers and the crew on board were in panic. People were running for life jackets. They were running for lifeboats, both steel and wood. But to no use. Crew were trying to put people in the boats, but as soon as they hit that water, they were engulfed with oil and seawater. And they all turned over. Oh, mothers were screaming on board, trying desperately to wrap their infants in warm clothing. Oh yes, there were flotation rings enough for everybody. What use is a flotation ring in that water with that oil? It took 20 minutes for me to sink. 20. 367 people. Men, women, children. 24 horses and 5 dogs. Gone. Gone. It was not my fault. It was not my fault. It was not my fault. Of course, the following day, when Captain Ledbetter came into the canal, when he came into the canal, he couldn't see anything because the wind and the storm had carried away all the boats, the oil, and yes, the bodies. He circled the canal. They stayed there for hours. Over 2 days, they recovered 100 bodies, oil-soaked, hardly recognizable. But miracle of miracles, wonder of wonders, one survivor. One of the dogs, an English setter, who was able, amazing creature, to swim out in that water and get carried by the current down several miles to an island. She was found 2 days later. One survivor. They looked up and down the canal for days. They even found bodies 27 miles away. Frank Lowell, you remember Frank, the CP agent in Juneau, was devastated when he heard the news. And he said, I planned for 2 days to have all these arrangements made that all those passengers, all of them, could be sheltered and fed and taken care of. I planned that. He even contacted Charles Beadle, our purser, to tell the passengers and crew that arrangements are being made. We even have stabling for the 24 horses. You'll be okay. Saturday afternoon, Frank Lowell was making different arrangements. He was making arrangements not for rescue, but recovery. Juneau became the center for recovery. Over the next few days, the bodies were brought in. Slowly. Frank Lowell organized teams of men and women who lived in Juneau. Teams who would prepare and wash and house the bodies. The female volunteers would wash and prepare the female bodies. And the males would wash and prepare the males. Oh, this task was horribly difficult, but made even more so when they had to deal with the children and infants. And yet, Juneau stepped up to the task. Do you know when a reporter came up to the mayor and said, "May I have a list of the valiant volunteers, these people that are doing this incredible work?" "A list of volunteers?" said the mayor. And he looked at him and he said, "The whole town. The whole town is here." I want to acknowledge another Alaskan that stepped up. Thomas Riggs. Thomas Riggs was the young governor who had recently been elected. Thomas Riggs was an educated Princeton man engineer, and he was a hands-on worker. He said, "This is our problem." He went to Captain Ledbetter on the Cedar and said, "Count me in, I'm part of your recovery team." And he himself went out with the hip waders out to find more bodies. He was even part of the shore excursions, and he went out on that snow and icy covered beaches, and he too helped in the recovery. Thomas Riggs was core to dealing with all the communication that came into Juneau. You can imagine. This hit the news, and it hit hard. At first we were stuck on a reef, but okay, and now it was disaster. He had to fend off the press, he had to deal with the families, he had to deal with CP officials and all manner of other communication. And with Frank Lowell, they organized such a comprehensive recovery search that scanned beyond the Lynn Canal, from Haines in the north to Admiralty Island in the south. And he had to deal with a lot of flack. Captain Locke, Leonard Locke's body was never recovered like dozens of others, nor was the logbook. And so the rumors started. The rumors and the accusations, the finger pointing, the blame. Someone was responsible. The same questions were coming up and down the coast. Could this accident not have been prevented? What could have been done? And the worst question of all, why didn't they offload those passengers that first day? Captain Riggs, Governor Riggs had had enough. He said, "This is not a time for finger pointing or blame. This is a time for us coming together and helping in any way we can." And he issued a proclamation. And that proclamation was sent out to the newspapers, and it was sent out over radio. And it went something like this at the end. "And though we are all small and helpless, we must seek guidance and strength to be of service when needed." Well, it helped. Somewhat. But the families of the crew, some members of the crew, and some of the passengers' families were not satisfied, and they set up a lawsuit against Canadian Pacific and Captain Locke in particular, blaming them. Both lawsuits failed. It was deemed that the captain and Canadian Pacific were absolved of all wrongdoing. It would seem that the events on Vanderbilt Reef in that October 1918 were perils of the sea, A tragic accident. Now, Governor Riggs had to deal with these bodies, and 156 of them needed to be transported to Vancouver, Victoria, and Seattle. Who would take that task on? My sister ship. The Princess Alice stepped up. She came into Juneau, and she took on 156 recovered bodies that were brought first to Vancouver. They left on November 8th, and on November 11th, a Sunday, they arrived at Pier D, Cold Harbor, to trumpets blaring and horns blasting. The Ship of Sorrows, she was called, the funeral ship, draped in black. But the city of Vancouver was in celebration. November 11th was Armistice Day, the end of the Great War at last. Some very kind-hearted, solid volunteers came down to identify some of those bodies. And there was also space created for 73 of them to be buried at Mountain View Cemetery, up at Fraser and 43rd. 25 of those on board were brought down to Victoria, and they rest in Ross Bay Cemetery. The other 61 were brought to Seattle on the Princess Adelaide for burial in Seattle and beyond. But CP said the weather was too bad now. We had to stop. We have to stop. The winter has set in. The storms are now. We cannot go and look any further. Governor Riggs reluctantly agreed, but did on his own pursue 2 more weeks of recovery. And enter Alan Winchell. Alan Winchell turned the story around. Alan was married to Eileen Winchell. They were from Dawson. Eileen was aboard Sophia. She was on my ship, cabin 35. Eileen was only 31, originally from San Francisco. She was a devoted wife, but was failing. Her health was failing in Dawson because of the climate. So they agreed she would return to California for the winter. But once they were at Skagway Pier, she looked at Al and said, "If something should happen, please bury me with Mother in San Francisco." And he held her, and he said, "Yes." We know what happened to Eileen Winchell. She, unfortunately, had not been recovered in that first weeks. Al could not bear it, and with his own funds, he hired a boat and divers and went out to Vanderbilt Reef, and they went searching for Eileen in the deep, in my corridors that were now water-filled. They came up with 1, 2, then 4 bodies. None of them was his beloved Eileen. But there was such a scandal made that CP had stopped the rescues, and a private citizen with his own finances is bringing people up out of the wreck. It was a shame on Canadian Pacific, and they immediately put together a team and were back out with a boat and 2 divers. And I'm here to tell you that in the next few days, they recovered 86 bodies. One of them, his beloved Eileen. So Al was able to honor her last request and brought Eileen back to San Francisco to lay with her mother. Another twist with our friend Frank Lowell. He was informed that there were gold nuggets on board Sophia. Oh, not only was there $70,000 worth of gold in the safe, but there could be up to $100,000 in cash in the mail bags. It didn't take CP very long to get a ship to go out and look for those. And they found the money. And they found the nuggets. And the two divers that went down on their final trip came back up to the surface and took one look at my mast and said, "It's time." And they took the mast down. That would seem to be the last of me above water. And so I lay there, still to this day, firmly attached to Vanderbilt Reef, still. My bow is covered in plumas and anemones, these great, beauteous growths that open and close in greeting. And I, dear ones, I'm so grateful. I am grateful that you listened to my story. And I am so grateful to be able to tell it. I am quite at peace. So ends my tale.
Wow.
Thank you. 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 Please. Please. Thank you. Thank you so much, dear ones. You are dear ones. It's an amazing adventure for me. I so appreciate it. Sophia appreciates, and so does Margaret. It's an amazing opportunity for me, and I can't explain what that ship means or how she touches me. And I talked about it with some folk, and I don't fully understand it, but I honor it. And I'm grateful to you for coming out and listening to this, and I'm grateful for the beloved ATT team that sit there, Barb and Sheila, our beloved Dorothy and Greg. Thank you, and Christine, and Sandy Cole, who went above and beyond with Sandy and Bev Cole, who brought period pieces of plates and to bring with her grandmother's plates and to say, it's all about your time. So that was so dear, and I'm so grateful. Really grateful. And if you want to catch your breath, or if you have a question right off the top, as Sharon and Chuck, they were so gracious. I was able to have a rehearsal, and I'll bet you see a difference in the telling today. I had, and you, this is their dog here on the. You must come and have a look. Their dog is Floyd, and Floyd's a low maintenance dog. Real low maintenance, and a lovely, lovely companion. And when I looked at Floyd, I said, but Floyd looks like the survivor from the Sophia. The Sophia has rippled out in so many ways. There are people who have done an opera on the Sophia. There's an artist up in Juneau who created 25 paintings depicting the actual story. And there is at the table at the back, you'll see there's a group, a chamber orchestra in Vancouver that hired 3 composers and did the most magical piece about remembering the Sophia, a theatrical piece that I had the honor of attending with descendants of the family who were at what is that called? Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. So that was just 2 weeks ago, where that we celebrated the tombstone, the marker. All the O'Briens, the 7 O'Briens, are in that cemetery, as well as many descendants. And it was a remarkable thing to walk with the families and go to the tomb where the O'Briens are interred. So if you have questions, have at it. Yes.
I just wondered, Margaret, if you would be taking us back up to the area, doing what you're doing today, back up to the area where this took place.
Oh, that's a great question. Would I take this back up to I would love to go to Juneau and Skagway. I'll tell you where, the question is, would I take it back up to the area where this occurred? One of the great connections we made, Noel and I went down to the Maritime Museum of BC. That's the one in the smaller museum here on the island in Victoria. There is a man named David Leverton, and he is, if I'm been tapped with the Sophia ferry, he is the walking encyclopedia of Sophia, so he has been doing what you say. He's been going up to Juneau and Whitehorse, and he's been telling, he's a historian. His name is David Leverton, and for the last 30 years he's been trying to spread the word about Sophia, and we never heard of it until mid-May on that ship. Penny. Yeah, it was interesting, so I would love to. Now, as saying that, they have organized a Princess Sophia exhibition that travels, and next year goes to Ottawa, which is my hometown. So I was hoping that might happen. And then Sharon and Chuck were saying, well, what about like maritime centers or museums? That I would love. And then someone else said, I think this is a high school piece, a piece that would help understand. Everyone I talk to about Sophia has a memory of it or a connection to it or none at all. And you know, like they just say, I do know, and I have been speaking with a lovely member of our audience who inspired the Ada Murray comment because she came forward and said to me, may I say your name, Ellie? Okay, Ellie's in the back row. And Ellie said to me just the other day, and I love these, she said, actually, my grandmother's piano was on the Sophia. Her grandmother was Ada Murray. She's in the story now. The interesting part is Ada had several children. One of them was Grace, Ellie's mother. And I have permission to tell you this, that Ada and Grace were some of the volunteers in Vancouver that November 11th that had to come and identify some of these bodies. They were part of that, so that's an amazing link to that. Yeah, so there are snippets of stories. I'm getting people calling up saying, do you know the Very family? And I said, 367 people on board. I didn't know the Verys. And they said, well, they were the second cousins of my father's brother, and it's so great. There are people with these amazing connections to this ship, which is lovely. It needs to be told. David Leverton said it beautifully. It's part of our history. It got shelved. All the reports and all the information from Canadian Pacific, lost. Conveniently lost. So there's a group of us that said, I think we gotta dust that off a little, right? So there's 2 books, they're at the back. And this beautiful, this is quite lovely too. It's the Mint, the Royal Canadian Mint put out an anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the Sophia. So it's a $20 silver coin, and it's beautiful in detail. Again, the Maritime Museum was instrumental in providing the look of it, the colors of it, and the whole history behind this, because David Leverton was involved.